Welcome to Alan Skorski Reports. I'm Alan Skorski. As we record this interview the week of Tisha B'Av, the topic of Jewish Democrats attacking Israel and the Jewish state couldn't be more timely. On July 8th, former Obama Chief of Staff, Mayor of Chicago, and 2028 presidential aspirant Rahm Emanuel traveled to Israel to lecture Israelis that Bibi has to go and that the strong U.S.-Israel relationship has run its course. But the Democrats' war on Israel didn't start 2 weeks ago or even after October 7th. Going back to the 90s, over 30 years ago, when Bill Clinton was president, he forced Yitzhak Rabin to tolerate the Palestinian terror attacks in order to keep the Oslo Accords alive. When Bibi became prime minister, following Rabin's assassination, the Clinton administration sought to undermine him, according to former Ambassador Dennis Ross. During the more pro-Israel George W. Bush administration, Democrat leaders constantly tried to reassure Jewish Democrats that when it comes to Israel, quote, there is no difference between Republicans and Democrats. During the Obama administration, there was a dramatic shift away from Israel and in support of the Palestinian cause, even comparing that cause to the Holocaust when President Obama spoke at Cairo University. President Obama gave rise to J Street, and at the 2012 Obama Democrat Convention, we saw Democrat delegates booing against recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. In 2018, with the victories of AOC, Rashida Tlaib, and the Squad, Jewish Democrats dismissed this threat as just four voices. On April 15th of this year, Bernie Sanders garnered support from 40 Democrats to block arms sales to Israel, and a few weeks ago, over 100 Democrats in Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, supported the Massey-Kana bill to end arms sales to Israel. There are countless many more examples of the Democrats' war against Israel, which is why I wanted to have today's guest, Jonathan Tobin, the Senior Editor-in-Chief of JNS. Jonathan is also the host of JNS Think Twice podcast, both the weekly video program and the Jonathan Tobin daily program, which are both available on all major audio platforms and YouTube. Jonathan Tobin, it's an honor to have you. How have you been?
Great to be with you, Alan. Thank you.
Okay, so you recently, I think it just came out today, as a matter of fact, an article that came out on JNS titled Denial Inside the Modern Siege Lines on Tisha B'Av. And how timely, because it hit so many points of things that I think about all the time. I'm on social media, primarily Facebook, and I'm constantly going after other Jews who attack Israel. It bothers me that I'm fighting with other Jews because Tisha B'Av is always on my mind throughout the year. But then I say, if I don't say anything, is that a greater disservice? We have people, besides Hamas and the PLO and all their allies, we face Neturei Karta and Jewish Voice for Peace. And now you had Rahm Emanuel going to Israel. So the way I see it, we almost don't have a choice, but we must fight against other Jews because Israel's survival is at stake.
Yeah, well, listen, we have to call things by the right names. On Tisha B'Av, the lesson of Tisha B'Av for Jews traditionally was disunity causes destruction. What happened inside the walls of besieged Jerusalem was that there was a civil war, a literal civil war going on. The zealots actually burned the food supplies, as part of a way to get at its enemies inside Jerusalem. And my point in writing about it in the column I wrote most recently was to say that, yes, we need to avoid sinat chinam, mindless, baseless hatred against fellow Jews or against anybody. That will undermine everything. But, what happened inside Jerusalem wasn't analogous to this. What we have now are people who are literally trying to help the enemy outside the walls, outside, we're inside the siege lines. And I think many Jews simply don't understand, despite the evidence of the last 3 years, that we are under siege. We are being attacked, primarily from the left in the United States, but also from part of the right. And we have to act accordingly. We have to draw the proper conclusions from this. And as much as we shouldn't dehumanize anyone, we're not for violence against anyone. But what we do have to do is call out those who are aiding and abetting those who are seeking the destruction of not just Israel, but of the Jewish people. You know, when they accuse Israel of genocide, and they falsely accuse Israel of genocide, they're basically telling us what they want to do because the only genocidal actor in this conflict are the Palestinians. Their goal is the genocide of Israel, of its population. When they chant for, that's what they mean when they chant from the river to the sea. They want to erase Israel and the Jewish people in its ancient homeland. When they say globalized intifada, they're for terrorism against Jews everywhere. We can't be silent about that. We can't ignore that. In fact, we have to be vigorously attacking people and saying that this is wrong, saying those leaders, New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani being the most prominent, that these are people who are advocating for evil, not just that they're wrong. This is evil. This is something about which we cannot agree to disagree because our survival is at stake. The survival of the West is at stake in this conflict, and that's, I think, where we have to start.
Right. So one of the biggest lies, because I've been following this for years, and in this column also you referenced the fight over the Supreme Court, that Jews against Jews. And I remember then, and I remember posting on Facebook, I didn't predict October 7th, but I predicted that we were going to be attacked, because never had I seen the people of Israel going at each other. And to me, Bibi's biggest mistake was not that he wanted to reform the Supreme Court, but that he didn't explain, at least to the world. Because here in America, and even with Jewish Democrats who support Israel in their own way, to them, they thought that their Supreme Court in Israel is like our Supreme Court in America. And Bibi he said, you don't understand something. In America, your president nominates somebody. They go through a Senate confirmation hearing and then a vote on the floor. Here in Israel, Supreme Court justices pick their own successors. So would you in America, especially you Democrats, would you tolerate Samuel Alito or any of the other conservative justices when they retire naming their own successor? But he didn't do that. So nobody here in America understood what reforming the Supreme Court in Israel is all about.
Well, I don't know that nobody knew. And to be fair to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I don't know that anybody on the left is listening to him, no matter what he says or how, able he would be in saying it. It's true. And I think the problem, if you're talking about American perceptions of the Israeli debate about judicial reform, is that the slogans used by the left in both countries are similar. They both claim to be defending democracy. In America, they think the left claims to be defending democracy against Trump, and they did that by trying to imprison their opponents, like as if it was a banana republic. It was hypocrisy. In Israel, the hypocrisy was, quite frankly, even greater. They adopted the sort of Democratic Party slogan of, we're defending democracy, but their goal was actually to thwart democracy. The power of the judiciary in Israel is greater than in any other democratic country in the world. There is no court that claims, and frankly, arrogated it to itself. It is nowhere rooted in law. It was not in Israel's founding. It is merely an attempt by the liberal Supreme Court to not merely act as a check on a more conservative Knesset, that would be legitimate, but that it is in essence claims it has the right to write its own constitution, to override not merely, unconstitutional laws without actually saying why they're unconstitutional. They believe the Constitution is whatever they say it is.
Right.
And Israel is a country without a written constitution, and that is especially dangerous. And, it's more part of this culture war between the left and the right. After 2022, the election, November 22, when the Israeli right won an outright majority, really for the first time in that way, The left, looking at the demographics of Israel's population, said, "Well, my God, we're never going to win another election, so we have to hold on to the court at all costs because that's the only way we can retain power."
Right.
And they mobilized a significant portion of, the electorate, not a majority certainly, but most of the elites. And I think the important point, from where we started with this is not so much the rights and wrongs of this debate. You could have a debate about, how much reform the court needs. I think it needs to be completely reformed. It operates in a way that is quite frankly, extra legal. I mean, no, the American Supreme Court at its most activist would never dream of doing the things that the Israeli Supreme Court does. It doesn't recognize justiciability. It does, that they don't, there doesn't have to be a law at stake. Nobody, they claim
Right.
the right to override anything that the government does under any circumstances
Right.
without respect to law. But the point here is that the people who were defending this out of control Supreme Court were ready to basically bring the state down,
Right.
hamper its defenses. And, as part of this culture comp, this culture where they were fighting with the right. And yes, that did, convince Hamas that it was time to strike. Now, the blame for October 7th, I think Prime Minister Netanyahu has to accept some of it. It happened on his watch.
Right.
But of course, it's not, as I keep trying to point out, it's not as if anybody in the opposition really wanted to do anything differently than he was doing before October 7th. There was no groundswell of support the Israeli opposition parties for an invasion of Gaza to get rid of Hamas. I mean, any suggestion of that would have been considered insane prior to October 7th. So it's a bit unfair. But the point here is that they basically held the country hostage, and terrible things happened because of that. I don't think they blame it all on Netanyahu because they blame everything on Netanyahu, the way Americans who don't like Trump blame everything on Trump.
Right.
You can blame some things on both of these men, but what we're seeing here, this idea that they're defending democracy is ludicrous. In fact, it's a completely anti-democratic movement, the opposition to judicial reform, that they want to thwart democracy.
Right. So last month, you and JNS held a magnificent conference in Jerusalem at the Waldorf. I wasn't there, but I watched it online, and as they say, next year in Jerusalem, I hope to be there. Everybody was there. I mean, it was just a great conference. So let me ask you a question, because you had to get just the best of the best over there. What is the feeling there? As far as the greatest threat to them, what are they saying or thinking about what's happening in America? Did they say, I saw this coming, I knew it? They completely caught off guard by it? I mean, I'm guessing because we all see the threat from both the left and the right, though I think it's more from the left, but doesn't mean that the right can't catch up at some point. Um, what was the overall feeling from all the conference participants about what's going on?
Well, obviously at the time that we held our summit, which, it was kind of a smash. We had over 1,200 people there, and all the major leaders, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and members of his cabinet, President Isaac Herzog, some of the leaders of the opposition like Naftali Bennett and Benny Gantz, and 200 other writers, scholars, thinkers. And to sum it up in one sentence would be impossible since we tackled all kinds of subjects at this summit, which was 3 days plus a Shabbaton. But I think, obviously they were deeply concerned about the war with Iran and its existential threat. And they're concerned, and I think people from the diaspora and in Israel are concerned about the surge of anti-Semitism around the world. Now, Israelis always, they tend to discount the diaspora, but I think there is a recognition that we are in a real crisis about that. And, there is a lot of different talk. I mean, but basically that we have to understand that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. We have to mobilize our friends, in the non-Jewish community, as bad as things can seem in this country at times with Mamdani and, Tucker Carlson,
Right.
all that. We are not alone. We have many friends. President Trump has his moments when he seems to be at odds with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but he's still obviously the most pro-Israel president we've ever had. Witness today his conditioning, giving things to the Saudis on their entering
Right.
the Abraham Accords, which
Right.
I hope we'll talk about a little later. There is, there is plenty of room. Jews need to fight. Jews need
Right.
to speak up. They can't abandon this fight. And, it was an important effort to gather the pro-Israel community together in Israel at our summit. I think people were energized by it and, enlivened by the discussions about the issues. But, we have our work cut out for us. We are in a fight, as we are at JNS every day, and, in our efforts to bring the truth about Israel, about the Jewish world, about the fight against anti-Semitism, to a broad audience, which is thankfully is growing and growing, and expanding into other languages from English. We've already started a Spanish edition. We are inaugurating within weeks a Hebrew edition, in addition that we're beefing up our news staff and having a 24/6, wire, news desk that will make us even more timely. But, we know we're in a fight
Right.
and we have to be aware of it. Obviously, there's an election that's going to be held in Israel later this fall, on October 27th. We'll see what that brings. But no matter what the outcome of that election is or what happens in the United States,
Right.
those of us who understand the need to speak up and to bring the truth to a broad audience, as broad as possible, we have to be ready to fight every day. And that's
Right.
what JNS is all about.
So let me ask you a question also. You, Shabbos Kestenbaum, every time I turn on the TV or anywhere on social media, he's at every debate and he wipes the floor with everybody. But there's only one Shabbos Kestenbaum. We need 1,000 guys like him.
Well, he
Um,
talks very, very, very fast, but
he
yeah, he
does.
can't talk for everybody.
But he's got that knowledge. I mean, he's got it in his. I mean, he's not. He's talking fast, but he's hitting those points. I mean, when I saw him on Piers Morgan, shutting up Anna Kasparin, and I think he's the first one to ever do that. I mean, that was quite a coup there. But basically, we don't have that, and I see just so many lapses. This thing about calling Israel genocide, apartheid, that's been going on literally for decades. I remember 15 years ago,
It's
Colombia
Soviet
National.
propaganda, is what
Yeah,
it is.
it's not. It's part of a bigger campaign. And I interviewed Warren Kinsella last month, who wrote the book The Hidden Hand, and it's about the campaign. And in the book, he referenced how about 30 years ago, I think, early 90s, a guy named Gary Wexler met with some Arab civil rights leader in Haifa, and this Arab leader told Gary Wexler, "We're going to get you. We're learning everything that you Jews do, and we're so this was all in the planning 30 years ago." And we're getting our asses handed to us. When J Street came to prominence during the Obama administration, that was it. They're nobody. They're just a small group. APAC. And now APAC is getting clobbered. And APAC, I mean, I see them all the time. They're getting candidates don't even want their money anymore. Who used to take their money. And APAC doesn't. I don't. At least I don't see any defense of APAC even defending themselves anymore. So where do we? What are we not doing? What do we have to do? Where is our hope
Part of
for
the
this?
problem starts with the fact that the Israelis themselves don't do a very good job. The Israeli government doesn't do really almost anything to that is effective to defend itself. Part of this is cultural. Israelis tend to, disdain efforts to have to explain themselves. Back to Ben Gurion, who said, what matters is what the Jews do, not what the non-Jews say about it. And there's some truth to that, but I think that created complacency, and I think even within the Netanyahu government, and especially in the prime minister's office, there's a sense that it doesn't matter what we say, nobody's going to believe us anyway. So let's just do our jobs and not worry about it. Clearly, there are people who are speaking up. There are venues. We have outlets like JNS We have advocates, many of whom are effective, some of whom less effective. But our problem, is that, we're fighting against something that can't be fought with, sort of, AI tricks or, social media strategies per se. This is a battle for the West. This is a broad cultural, it's rooted in the toxic theories of critical race theory,
Right.
intersectionality, and settler colonialism created, by the far left, and which have essentially taken over the American educational system, much of our culture, pretty much all of our culture, and indeed our journalism as well. And these are not people with whom you can argue.
Right.
As I always say, when it comes to monitoring media bias and in the mainstream media, I have bad news, worse news, and good news, and some slightly good news. The bad
Right.
news is that media bias against Israel is the worst it's ever been. The worst news is that it can't really be fixed in most of these venues
Right.
because, years ago, groups like Camera and Honest Reporting and others, they could correct the mistakes because
Right.
most of the bias against Israel was rooted in ignorance and in, lack of historical knowledge and lack, journalists who didn't speak the languages and know any of the context. And they could be corrected. Today's generation of journalists who are steeped, marinated in these toxic left-wing theories, which divides everything into this debate about race, and which falsely labels Israel and the Jews white oppressors and the
Mhm.
Palestinians people of color, who are always victims no matter what they do, and the Jews and the Israelis always in the wrong no matter what they do. Now, this is madness because the Jews are the most persecuted group in history, and also the majority of the Israeli population, majority of the Israeli Jews are people of color by the definitions of the American left because they trace their origins to the Middle East and North Africa. But this generation of journalists doesn't care. They think that the purpose of journalism isn't journalism or seeking truth. It's activism. It's bolstering one side that they're on. And they, that which is why October 7th, an incredible atrocity, did not generate sympathy for Israel really so much, in all these sectors as it did support for the people doing it, carrying out these crimes. And that is what led to the surge of anti-Semitism after October 7th. We have to recognize this. This is not a matter of just, out debating the other side. We have to understand this is rooted in a belief, that is as deep rooted as Nazism was a century ago, and understand that this is an existential battle. There are ways we can do it more effectively, and certainly Israel needs to do more. The American Jewish leadership, which is largely absent on this and has tried to do something, but largely faltered because they're not really willing to come to grips with the left-wing Marxist roots of this. They're not really willing to denounce the red-green coalition of Marxists and Islamists that have, dominated this discussion in much of the world. But that's the core of the problem.
Right.
It's not that these people say bad things and there are not enough Jews
Right.
speaking quickly enough like Shabbos Kestenbaum to
Yeah.
shout them down.
Right.
It's that we're fighting a battle that is not about spin. It's about a widespread belief, like the blood libels about genocide and
Right.
apartheid. It's not just that they're saying them, it's that it doesn't matter whether they're true or not. Zohran
Right.
Mamdani doesn't back it
Right.
up when he claims that Israel's committing genocide. He doesn't have to. He just uses the word because the Jews are the bad guys. Israel is the bad guy. Once that's we have to understand that that is the core of our problem. We're dealing with people who are not, engaging in
Right.
reasoned debate against us. So
Right.
it's not just that we have to be better debaters, although we
Right.
should be better debaters. It's that we are facing foes who want our deaths, who
Right.
want to destroy Israel. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not something where we can explain it better to them. We have to understand that these are people who are haters, and we have to label them as such.
Right.
These are hate groups. And they've insinuated themselves into the mainstream. It's become normative in the New York Times, on CNN, and throughout academia and throughout our culture. We have to call this out. We're not alone. It's a difficult task, but we are not alone, and we can do it.
Let me ask you a couple more questions. Also, one real quickie. I had a few friends who were at that JNS conference, and they said that they met with Carolyn Glick, and she gave them chizuk. She said, "Well, whatever else happening, we have the truth on our side." And I'm like, "So?" So that's what I want to ask you. I mean, and I've said this to other guests also. So yes, truth is on our side. So what?
Well, you could say so what? The
Yeah,
Nazis and their big lies
yeah,
dominated. They won for a long time. The
yeah,
communists and their lives, they won for a long time. But in the end, the contradictions inside their ideologies collapsed on their movements, and of course, it required their defeat, and in more than not just a rhetorical debate. It's not just we beat them in a debate. So yes, having truth on our side actually is good. But I think when, my friend Caroline says that, she's trying to remind us that, we can't give up. We should have, wherever I go, whenever I give speeches, I always tell audiences that we need a lot in fighting this fight. We need to know the facts. We need to arm ourselves with information. And most Jews, most people are ignorant about the history about all
yeah,
this. But we need something more, and that is courage. Without courage, all the other virtues, without all the knowledge in the world, doesn't matter, because if you aren't willing to step up and fight and speak truth to power wherever it is, it doesn't matter how true, it doesn't matter
right,
that the truth is on you, you have the truth and they're lying. But the knowledge that you have the truth should give you the courage. It should encourage you.
yeah,
It should embolden you to do what needs to be done, to reach out, to make allies where we have allies, and to not give up in this fight, and to be as aggressive and as strong in this as we possibly can. Part of our problem, certainly in the United States, is that we're a prosperous and self-satisfied community. Most Jews were caught by surprise that the
right,
institutions where they felt most at home, like elite universities, had not just turned on them, but had been captured by those who hate Jews.
right,
Well, they are lying. We are telling the truth. One man right is a majority of one. And we have to keep repeating that to ourselves in order to give ourselves, the chizuk to keep going.
right.
Too many people are giving up. I hear too much woe is me, doom and gloom. Sure, it's bad, but it's not 1933. It's not 1939. There's a blue and white flag flying over Jerusalem. We have a friend in the White House. Now, that may not always be true when it comes
Right.
to the White House, but we have many friends in this country. Let's not give up.
Jonathan Tobin, Senior Editor-in-Chief, and one of the greatest and most important voices in the Jewish community. I want to wish you a meaningful Tisha B'Av this year. Thank you so much for joining me, and many, many years of seeing you out there and fighting the good fight for our people.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay.